David had spent most of his life hearing people tell him what he could never become. Growing up in a small village outside Lagos, opportunities were scarce and dreams felt expensive. Every morning before sunrise, he would help his father repair old fishing nets before walking several kilometers to school. The roads were dusty, the classrooms overcrowded, and the future uncertain. But David carried something many people around him didn't possess anymore: hope. At night, while others slept, he sat beneath a flickering bulb reading books about successful entrepreneurs, immigrants, and people who transformed their lives through determination. He became fascinated with stories of ordinary people who crossed oceans and built extraordinary futures. One country appeared again and again in those stories: America. To David, America wasn't simply a place. It represented possibility. Years passed. He graduated from university with respectable grades, but reality quickly hit him. Jobs were difficult to find. The few positions available paid barely enough to survive. Still, David never stopped trying. Eventually he secured a modest office job where he worked long hours for very little money. That same year, he met Grace. Grace was beautiful, confident, and ambitious. Unlike many women in the village, she dreamed of luxury, designer clothes, expensive vacations, and social status. David admired her confidence. Grace admired David's kindness. Within 2 years, they married. For a while, life felt perfect. They rented a small apartment and filled it with laughter, dreams, and plans for the future. Every evening they would sit together discussing the life they hoped to build. One night David mentioned America. Again. Grace laughed softly. "You and this America dream." David smiled. "One day you'll see." She shook her head. "You've been saying that for years." But David never stopped believing. Then one ordinary Tuesday afternoon, everything changed. His phone vibrated while he was walking. An email. His hands trembled as he opened it. The words blurred before his eyes. He read them once. Twice. 3 times. Then he stood frozen. He had been selected. A legal work opportunity in America. After years of applications, interviews, and paperwork, the impossible had finally happened. David rushed home faster than he had ever moved before. His heart pounded with excitement. This was the moment he had dreamed about since childhood. The moment that would change everything. Or so he thought. Because when he finally shared the news with Grace, her reaction wasn't what he expected. And that single conversation would become the beginning of a journey neither of them would ever forget. David burst through the apartment door carrying more excitement than he had felt in years. "Grace." His voice echoed through the small living room. She emerged from the kitchen wiping her hands on a towel. What happened? David could barely contain himself. He handed her the phone. "Read it." Grace looked confused. Then she began reading. For a moment her expression remained blank. Then came a smile. But something about it felt strange. David couldn't explain why. The smile reached her lips but not her eyes. "You got it?" she asked. David nodded excitedly. "I got it." For several seconds the room fell silent. David expected celebration. A hug. Tears. Joy. Anything. Instead Grace sat down. "America." "Yes." "When?" 3 months. The excitement in David's chest slowly began to fade. Grace wasn't reacting the way he imagined. She stared at the floor. Then finally looked up. "And how much money do you actually have?" The question caught him off guard. "What?" "To move." David hesitated. "Not much." The process had consumed nearly all his savings. He would need loans. Additional work. Sacrifices. Grace sighed. A long sigh. The kind that carried disappointment. David noticed it immediately. What? She crossed her arms. Nothing. No. Tell me. Grace stood and walked toward the window. Then she spoke words David would never forget. David, sometimes I think you spend too much time chasing dreams. The room became quiet. David felt his stomach tighten. This isn't a dream anymore. Isn't it? Her voice wasn't cruel. It was worse. Dismissive. She listed every obstacle. The expenses. The risks. The uncertainty. The possibility of failure. By the time she finished speaking, the celebration David imagined no longer existed. Instead there was tension. Fear. Doubt. And for the first time, David wondered if the person closest to him truly believed in him at all. That night he barely slept. Not because of America, but because of Grace's reaction. And deep down, a small voice whispered something troubling. Maybe this journey would cost more than money. Maybe it would cost his marriage. Over the next few weeks, David's excitement slowly transformed into pressure. Every day brought a new expense. Passport fees. Medical examinations. Travel documents. Flight arrangements. Housing deposits. Everything seemed to cost more than he expected. His modest savings disappeared almost overnight. Soon he found himself working extra shifts after office hours. While others went home to rest, David drove for rideshare services late into the night. Sometimes he returned home after midnight. Other times he arrived just before sunrise. The exhaustion showed on his face. But whenever he imagined the future waiting for him, he kept going. He believed the sacrifice would be temporary. One evening he walked into the apartment carrying a notebook filled with calculations. He sat beside Grace. I think I can make it work. Grace barely looked up from her phone. What now? David opened the notebook. If I work overtime for another month and borrow a little from my cousin, I'll have enough. Grace sighed. Again. That sigh. The same one he had begun hearing more frequently. Borrow. Only temporarily. Grace shook her head. You always have a plan. David smiled. That's a good thing. No, David. Her voice became serious. It's not. He stared at her. What do you mean? She stood and pointed toward the apartments around them. We've been struggling for years. Her words hit harder than she intended. Look at this place. David remained silent. The furniture is old. The car barely works. We don't own anything. Every sentence felt like another stone being added to his shoulders. But that's exactly why I'm going, David replied. Grace folded her arms. And what if America changes nothing? The question hung in the air. David had asked himself that same question many times. But hearing it from her felt different. Because it wasn't concern. It sounded like expectation. As though she was already preparing for his failure. That night David sat alone on the balcony. The city lights flickered in the distance. For years he believed Grace was his biggest supporter. Now he wasn't so sure. Yet despite the growing tension, he made a decision. No matter what happened, he would go. Because if he gave up now, he would spend the rest of his life wondering what might have been. And David feared regret more than failure. What he didn't realize was that Grace had already started questioning whether she wanted to wait for his dream at all. The weeks disappeared quickly. Before David knew it, departure day had arrived. The airport buzzed with activity. Families hugged. Children laughed. Travelers rushed between terminals. Yet despite the crowd, David felt strangely alone. His parents had traveled hours to see him off. His mother cried openly. His father tried to remain strong but couldn't hide his emotions. "You make us proud," his father said. David nodded. Then his eyes searched for Grace. She stood several feet away. Quiet. Distant. Almost disconnected from the moment. When David approached her, he forced a smile. "Everything okay?" Grace nodded. "Of course." But her voice lacked warmth. David reached for her hand. She allowed it. Yet even that felt different. As if an invisible wall had appeared between them. "I'll call every day," David promised. "Okay. I'll send money as soon as I can." "Okay. I'll come back for you." Again. "Okay." Each answer sounded automatic. Emotionless. David's heart sank. This wasn't how he imagined saying goodbye to his wife. Around them, families were crying and embracing. Yet Grace seemed eager for the moment to end. Finally, boarding was announced. The reality hit him instantly. This was it. The beginning of a completely new life. David pulled Grace into a hug. For a brief moment she hugged him back. But the embrace felt short. Cold. Incomplete. As he walked towards security, he turned around one last time. His mother waved through tears. His father raised his hand proudly. Grace stood still. Watching. Expressionless. Something about that image stayed with David long after he boarded the plane. Hours later, as the aircraft climbed into the clouds, he stared out the window. Below him, Africa slowly disappeared beneath the darkness. Ahead of him lay uncertainty, opportunity, risk, and hope. But somewhere deep inside, a painful feeling refused to leave. For the first time, David wondered if his marriage might already be slipping away. America wasn't what David expected. It was harder. Much harder. The first apartment he rented was tiny. The neighborhood was rough. The rent consumed most of his income. His new job involved physically demanding labor. Every evening he returned home exhausted. His hands hurt. His back hurt. His feet hurt. Still, he refused to complain. Because every difficult day brought him one step closer to the future he wanted. At first he called Grace constantly. Morning. Afternoon. Night. He shared everything. The city. The work. The people. The opportunities. But something had changed. The conversations felt different. Shorter. Less personal. Less loving. One evening David called after completing a 14-hour shift. He was exhausted but excited. He had finally secured additional overtime work. More income. More progress. When Grace answered, he smiled. "I have good news." "What is it?" "I'll be earning extra money starting next week." He expected encouragement. Instead she asked only one question. "How much?" David paused. He gave her the number. Grace immediately began calculating. "That's still not enough." His smile disappeared. "What?" "You've been there for months." "I know. I thought you'd be doing much better by now." The words felt like a punch. David looked around his tiny apartment. The stained walls. The second-hand furniture. The sacrifices nobody saw. The loneliness nobody understood. Every struggle suddenly felt invisible. For the first time since arriving in America, he felt completely alone. After the call ended, he sat quietly in the darkness. The apartment felt emptier than ever. Outside, snow began falling. Inside, a realization slowly formed. Grace wasn't waiting for him anymore. She was waiting for success. And if success didn't arrive fast enough, she might not wait at all. Thousands of miles away, Grace stared at her phone after ending the call. And although David couldn't see it, another man had already started appearing in her life. A man who seemed to have everything David didn't. Money, status, comfort. And soon, Grace would face a choice that would change all three of their lives forever. While David spent his days carrying heavy boxes across freezing warehouses in America, life back home continued moving forward. At first, Grace tried convincing herself that everything was fine. David was still her husband. He was working hard. Eventually his sacrifices would pay off. At least that's what she told herself. But the reality was different. The apartment felt lonely. The village felt small. And every day social media showed her images of people living the lifestyle she desperately wanted. Luxury cars. Beautiful homes. Expensive vacations. Designer clothes. The kind of life David always promised but hadn't delivered. One Saturday afternoon, Grace attended a friend's birthday celebration at a popular restaurant in Lagos. The event was filled with successful business owners, professionals, and wealthy entrepreneurs. Grace arrived wearing her best outfit, hoping nobody would ask too many questions about her husband. Unfortunately, they did. "So how's America?" one woman asked. Grace forced a smile. "Fine. When is your husband bringing you over?" "Soon." "When are you buying your new house?" Again, she smiled. But inside she felt embarrassed. Because she had no answers. As the evening continued, she found herself sitting alone near the outdoor garden. That was when she met Michael. Michael entered the party like someone who owned the room. Expensive watch. Tailored suit. Luxury vehicle parked outside. Confidence radiated from him effortlessly. People greeted him with respect. Some even with admiration. Grace noticed him immediately. And eventually he noticed her. Their conversation started casually. Then continued. And continued. Michael knew exactly how to make people feel important. Unlike David, he rarely talked about hard work or future dreams. Michael talked about results. The businesses he owned. The investments he managed. The vacations he enjoyed. The success he had already achieved. By the end of the evening, Grace knew far more about Michael than she should have. And what troubled her most wasn't that she admired him. It was that she started comparing him to David. The comparison wasn't fair. David was still building. Michael had already arrived. But emotions rarely care about fairness. That night, as Grace lay in bed scrolling through photos from the party, one thought kept returning. What if she had married the wrong man? It was only a thought. A dangerous thought. But once it entered her mind, it refused to leave. And from that moment forward, the foundation of her marriage began to crack. The changes happened slowly. So slowly that neither Grace nor David noticed at first. Phone calls became shorter. Messages became less frequent. The excitement that once filled their conversations gradually disappeared. David still tried. Every morning he sent messages. Every evening he called. He shared stories from work. Funny experiences. Small victories. Future plans. But Grace no longer listened the same way. Whenever his name appeared on her phone, she felt less excitement than before. Meanwhile, Michael continued appearing in her life. At first it was harmless. A text message. A casual lunch. An invitation to a business event. Nothing inappropriate. At least not officially. But emotional distance rarely starts with obvious betrayal. It starts with attention. With comparison. With curiosity. Michael listened carefully when Grace spoke. He complimented her appearance. He asked about her dreams. He made her feel seen. One afternoon they sat together in a luxury cafe overlooking the city. Grace watched expensive cars pass by outside. Everything around her looked like the life she had imagined for herself. Michael noticed her staring. "You deserve more than you're settling for." The words lingered. Grace looked down at her coffee. "What do you mean?" Michael shrugged casually. "You're smart. Beautiful. Ambitious. You shouldn't have to struggle." The statement sounded innocent. But its impact was powerful. Because it echoed fears she had secretly carried for years. When she returned home that evening, David called. His face appeared on the screen. Tired. Exhausted. Dark circles under his eyes. Yet somehow still smiling. Grace suddenly found herself comparing him to Michael again. The comparison made her uncomfortable. Not because it was unfair. Because it revealed feelings she didn't want to admit. That night David spent nearly 20 minutes describing a promotion opportunity. Grace barely listened. For the first time in their marriage, she wanted the conversation to end. And somewhere thousands of miles away, David sensed it. He couldn't explain how. But he felt her slipping away. Like sand sliding through his fingers. And no matter how tightly he held on, he couldn't stop it. The winter arrived earlier than expected. David had never experienced cold like this before. Back home, winters were mild. In America, they felt merciless. The wind cut through clothing. Snow covered the streets. Temperatures dropped below anything he thought possible. Every morning he woke before sunrise. Every night he returned home after dark. His schedule became brutal. Warehouse shift. Overtime. Weekend jobs. Side gigs. Anything that moved him closer to financial stability. But despite working harder than ever, loneliness followed him everywhere. His small apartment felt colder than the weather outside. Sometimes entire weekends passed without meaningful conversation. His family missed him. His parents worried. And Grace seemed increasingly distant. One evening after finishing work, David checked his bank account. For the first time since arriving, he smiled. His savings had finally reached a significant milestone. Years earlier, this achievement would have been celebrated. Now he wasn't sure who to share it with. He called Grace immediately. The phone rang. And rang. And rang. No answer. Several hours later she replied. Busy. That was all. One word. David stared at the screen. Months earlier she would have called back instantly. Now she barely seemed interested. The silence hurt more than the cold. For the first time, David questioned everything. Had he made a mistake? Had chasing his dream cost him the people he loved most? Outside, snow continued falling. Inside, David sat alone beside the window. Watching strangers walk through the storm. Wondering why success felt so empty when there was nobody left to celebrate it with. And while he struggled through the hardest winter of his life, the biggest storm was still coming. The message arrived on an ordinary evening. David had just returned from work. His body ached. His feet hurt. His shoulders felt heavy. Yet despite the exhaustion, he smiled. Because he planned to surprise Grace. He had finally saved enough money to start preparing for her immigration process. The future they once dreamed about was finally becoming possible. Excited, he grabbed his phone. Before he could call her, a notification appeared. A message from Grace. At first he smiled. Then he opened it. And everything changed. David, I don't think this marriage is working anymore. His heart stopped. He read the sentence again. And again. And again. The words refused to make sense. He called immediately. No answer. He called again. Nothing. Again. Nothing. Hours later she finally responded. Not with a call. Another message. Code. Short. Final. We've grown apart. I need a different life. I'm sorry. David sat motionless. The apartment felt silent. The world felt silent. After years of sacrifice. Years of hard work. Years of loneliness. Everything seemed to collapse into a few simple sentences. The woman he loved was leaving. And she wasn't even willing to say it face to face. That night David didn't sleep. He simply sat in darkness staring at the phone. Trying to understand how someone could become a stranger so quickly. But what hurt most wasn't losing Grace. It was realizing she had stopped believing in him long before he ever boarded that plane. Weeks later, the truth finally emerged. Grace wasn't simply leaving. She had already moved on. Michael had become a permanent part of her life. When David learned this, something inside him shattered. Not because another man existed, but because he realized the timeline. The emotional distance. The cold conversations. The unanswered calls. It all suddenly made sense. For months he had been fighting to save a marriage that no longer existed. The realization was brutal. At first anger consumed him. Then sadness. Then silence. Friends encouraged revenge. Some encouraged confrontation. Others told him to expose her publicly. But David did none of those things. Instead, he made a decision. A decision that would change everything. If Grace wanted to leave, he would let her. If she believed he would fail, he would prove her wrong. Not for revenge. Not for validation. For himself. The divorce process moved forward. Painfully. Slowly. And when the final documents were completed, David sat alone in his apartment holding the papers. Years of memories reduced to a few signatures. He expected to feel broken. Instead he felt something unexpected. Freedom. For the first time in years, nobody doubted him. Nobody criticized his dreams. Nobody measured his worth by how quickly success arrived. The chapter was over. Grace believed she had chosen the better future. Michael believed he had won. Neither of them knew what was coming. Because the heartbreak that nearly destroyed David was about to become the fuel that transformed his entire life. And 4 years later, the same woman who walked away would stand face to face with a man she no longer recognized. For weeks after the divorce was finalized, David lived like a man walking through fog. He woke up. He went to work. He came home. He slept. Then repeated the cycle. The pain followed him everywhere. In the warehouse. On the bus. Inside grocery stores. Even in his dreams. The hardest moments came unexpectedly. A song they once loved. An old photograph hidden in his phone. A memory that appeared without warning. Each one reopened wounds he was desperately trying to close. One Saturday morning, David sat alone in a small cafe near his apartment. The divorce papers were still saved in his backpack. He hadn't touched them in weeks. Yet somehow they felt heavier every day. As he stirred his coffee, an older man sitting nearby noticed his expression. "You look like someone carrying a mountain." David forced a smile. "Maybe I am." The man chuckled. Then he said something David would never forget. "Pain can either bury a man or build him." David remained silent. The stranger stood and prepared to leave. Before walking away, he added one final sentence. "Most people waste their suffering. Don't be one of them." For reasons David couldn't explain, those words stayed with him. All day. All week. Eventually, they became an obsession. Most people waste their suffering. One night he returned home and looked around his tiny apartment. Everything suddenly felt different. He realized he had spent months focusing on what he lost. Grace. His marriage. His plans. His expectations. But what if he focused on what remained? His health. His intelligence. His work ethic. His future. For the first time since the divorce, David opened a blank notebook. At the top of the page he wrote, "The next 4 years." Then he began creating goals. Financial goals. Business goals. Personal goals. Learning goals. Fitness goals. The list continued for hours. By sunrise, the notebook contained more purpose than his life had possessed in years. David made a promise to himself. No distractions. No excuses. No self-pity. Every ounce of pain would become fuel. Every disappointment would become motivation. Every rejection would become energy. The man Grace left behind would no longer exist. And although David didn't know it yet, that notebook would become the blueprint for everything that followed. Success did not arrive quickly. It never does. The internet made entrepreneurship look glamorous. David discovered the truth. It was exhausting. Every day he worked his regular job. Every evening he studied business. Every night he researched opportunities. While others watched movies, David watched educational videos. While others slept, David learned new skills. His social life disappeared. His weekends vanished. His comfort zone ceased to exist. Months later, he noticed a pattern. Small companies constantly struggled with transportation and deliveries. Missed shipments. Late arrivals. Poor communication. The problem existed everywhere. And where problems exist, opportunities often hide. David became fascinated. He spent weeks researching logistics. Then months. Soon he understood something important. The industry wasn't glamorous. But it was essential. Every product had to move. Every business needed transportation. Every supply chain depended on reliability. The opportunity was enormous. Unfortunately, David had almost no capital. Starting seemed impossible. But he remembered something from childhood. His father used to say, "If you can't start big, start small." So he did. Instead of buying trucks, he started as a coordinator. Instead of owning equipment, he connected people who already owned it. Instead of waiting for perfect conditions, he acted. The first client paid very little. The second wasn't much better. The third nearly disappeared without paying at all. Mistakes happened constantly. Problems emerged daily. Several times David considered quitting. Yet every setback taught him something valuable. And every lesson improved the business. Slowly, customers began returning. Then recommending him to others. Then bringing friends. By the end of the first year, the side business generated more income than he ever expected. Not enough to quit his job, but enough to prove he was moving in the right direction. For the first time in years, David felt momentum. The future no longer seemed like a dream. It felt like a destination. And he was finally moving toward it. 2 years after his divorce, David received a phone call that changed everything. At first, he almost ignored it. Unknown number. Busy schedule. Nothing unusual. Fortunately, he answered. The caller represented a regional manufacturing company. One of David's previous clients had recommended him. The company needed transportation support across multiple states. The contract was massive compared to anything David had handled before. For several seconds, he couldn't speak. This was the opportunity he had been working toward. The opportunity he had dreamed about. But there was one problem. His company wasn't ready. At least not yet. The contract required resources far beyond his current capacity. Most people would have declined. David didn't. Instead, he spent 3 sleepless weeks building partnerships, negotiating agreements, recruiting drivers, creating systems, solving problems. Every obstacle became a puzzle. Every challenge became a mission. Finally, the launch day arrived. David barely slept the night before. Too much depended on success. One mistake could destroy everything. The first week was chaotic. The second week was stressful. The third week felt impossible. But gradually, things stabilized. Deliveries arrived on time. Customers remained satisfied. Operations improved. Then came the moment David would never forget. The company renewed the contract. For 3 years. At a significantly larger value. David stared at the agreement in disbelief. The business he built from nothing was no longer surviving. It was growing. Rapidly. And for the first time, he allowed himself a rare moment of celebration. Not because he had become rich. Because he had proven something to himself. He wasn't the failure people imagined. He was exactly who he always believed he could become. While David's world expanded, Grace's world slowly began shrinking. At first, life with Michael seemed perfect. The expensive dinners. The luxury trips. The beautiful photographs. Everything looked impressive online. Friends admired her. Family members envied her. For a while, Grace believed she had made the right choice. Then reality appeared. Michael wasn't the man she imagined. The confidence that once attracted her slowly revealed another side. Control. Arrogance. Selfishness. He enjoyed admiration but disliked criticism. He expected loyalty but rarely offered it. Most importantly, he viewed relationships as conveniences. Not commitments. The warning signs appeared gradually. Missed promises. Cancelled plans. Late-night absences. Mysterious phone calls. Excuses that never quite made sense. Whenever Grace asked questions, Michael became defensive. Eventually, arguments became frequent. Then constant. One evening after a particularly painful disagreement, Grace sat alone inside their luxury home. The house was beautiful. But it felt empty. For the first time, she thought about David. Not the struggling immigrant. The man. The husband. The person who always called. Always listened. Always tried. A strange feeling settled over her. Regret. Not overwhelming regret. Not yet. Just enough to make her uncomfortable. Enough to keep her awake. Enough to make her wonder whether appearances had blinded her. Because although Michael provided comfort, David had provided something far more difficult to replace. Commitment. And she was beginning to understand the difference. By the third year, the contrast between David and Grace had become impossible to ignore. Every month David's business expanded. New contracts. New employees. New opportunities. He purchased his first commercial vehicle. Then another. Then several more. The company that once existed inside a notebook now employed real people. Families depended on it. Communities benefited from it. David worked harder than ever. Yet something about him had changed. The anger disappeared. The bitterness faded. The desire to prove people wrong slowly vanished. He no longer chased success to impress anyone. He pursued it because he loved building. Meanwhile, Grace found herself trapped inside a life that looked impressive from the outside but felt increasingly fragile within. Michael traveled frequently. Communication declined. Arguments intensified. Trust evaporated. One afternoon Grace accidentally discovered messages that confirmed her deepest fears. Michael had been seeing other women for months. The revelation shattered whatever illusions remained. When she confronted him, he barely apologized. That response hurt more than the betrayal itself, because it revealed how little he valued the relationship. That night Grace sat alone remembering conversations she once considered boring. Simple dinners with David. Quiet evenings together. Shared dreams. Small moments she never appreciated. For the first time, she understood something painful. She had confused temporary success with permanent character. And now she was paying the price. Across the ocean, David stood inside his growing warehouse watching employees load shipments. His company logo stretched across multiple vehicles. Customers respected him. Partners trusted him. The future looked brighter than ever. Neither David nor Grace knew it yet. But destiny was quietly moving them toward one final meeting. A meeting that would force both of them to confront the choices that changed their lives forever. The fourth year began with a phone call that would change the scale of David's business forever. By now, his logistics company was no longer a side project. It had become a respected operation serving multiple regions. What once started with a notebook, a second-hand laptop, and a dream had transformed into a real company. But David wasn't satisfied. He had learned something during his years in America. Success wasn't a destination. It was a responsibility. The more progress he made, the more people depended on him. Drivers depended on him. Office staff depended on him. Their families depended on him. Every decision carried weight. Every mistake affected lives. One morning, David stood inside his warehouse watching dozens of employees prepare shipments. Forklifts moved across the floor. Trucks lined up outside. Phones rang continuously. The scene felt surreal. For years earlier he had stood alone in a freezing apartment wondering if his life had fallen apart. Now he was leading an organization that continued growing faster than he imagined. His operations manager approached him. "We received another offer." David smiled. "What kind?" The manager handed him a folder. David opened it. Then paused. The contract was enormous. Much larger than anything they had previously handled. Winning it would double the company's revenue. Losing it could slow their expansion for years. Most entrepreneurs would have celebrated immediately. David didn't. Experience had taught him caution. He spent weeks reviewing every detail. Meeting experts. Consulting advisors. Preparing systems. When the agreement was finally signed, the company entered an entirely new level. Additional trucks were purchased. New offices opened. More employees joined. The growth attracted media attention. Industry leaders began noticing his success. Investors started calling. For the first time, David became something he never expected. Respected. Not because he became rich. Because he built something valuable. Yet despite all the recognition, one habit never changed. Every evening before leaving the office, David walked through the warehouse personally thanking employees. Because he remembered exactly what it felt like to work long hours while nobody noticed. The empire was expanding. But David never forgot the man who started with nothing. And that humility would soon separate him from people like Michael. Because while David's success continued rising, Michael's world was beginning to collapse. Michael had always believed success made him untouchable. For years, that belief appeared true. Money solved problems. Influence opened doors. Connections protected him. Whenever difficulties appeared, he simply paid someone to make them disappear. But eventually every shortcut collects a price. The first warning arrived quietly. A business partner withdrew from an important project. Then another. Then another. Michael dismissed the concerns. Temporary setbacks. Nothing serious. At least that's what he told himself. The truth was far worse. Several risky investments had begun failing simultaneously. Projects that looked profitable on paper were bleeding money behind the scenes. Loans were piling up. Investors were growing nervous. Creditors were demanding answers. Still, Michael maintained appearances. Luxury vehicles remained parked outside. Designer suits remained perfectly tailored. Expensive dinners continued. Social media still displayed a life of effortless success. But behind closed doors, panic was spreading. One afternoon, Michael entered his office expecting another routine meeting. Instead, he found 3 angry investors waiting. The conversation lasted less than an hour. By the time it ended, Michael realized something terrifying. The safety net beneath him was disappearing. Fast. For the first time in years, fear entered his life. Real fear. The kind money couldn't immediately solve. When he returned home that evening, Grace noticed the change instantly. His confidence seemed weaker. His patience shorter. His smile forced. "What happened?" she asked. "Nothing." The answer came too quickly. Grace knew he was lying. Over the following months, the pressure intensified. Arguments became more frequent. Michael spent hours staring at financial reports. Phone calls turned tense. Meetings became secretive. And slowly, the man who once appeared unstoppable began unraveling. Grace watched it happen. At first she felt concern. Then confusion. Then dread. Because the life she sacrificed everything to obtain suddenly looked far less secure than before. The foundation beneath her future was cracking. And she had no idea how deep the damage truly went. The collapse happened faster than anyone expected. Within a year, several of Michael's businesses failed. Properties were sold. Vehicles disappeared. Staff members were dismissed. The luxurious lifestyle that once seemed permanent evaporated almost overnight. Grace watched helplessly. Each week brought another loss. Another disappointment. Another argument. Eventually the stress transformed Michael completely. The charming man she met years earlier vanished. In his place stood someone bitter and angry. Someone constantly searching for people to blame. One evening the tension finally exploded. A simple disagreement escalated into a brutal argument. Months of frustration poured out. Accusations. Regrets. Resentment. Everything surfaced. Then Michael said something Grace would never forget. "You were attracted to my success." The statement felt like a knife. Because deep down, she knew there was truth inside it. The silence that followed felt unbearable. A few weeks later, Michael left. Not temporarily. Permanently. Their relationship ended with far less drama than it began. No grand speeches. No emotional reconciliation. Just distance. Then absence. Suddenly Grace found herself alone. Again. Only this time things were different. Much different. She wasn't the young woman who once dreamed about luxury. She wasn't the confident wife waiting for America to deliver success. She was older. Tired. And unemployed. The savings disappeared quickly. Bills continued arriving. Eventually she sold personal belongings to cover expenses. The reality became impossible to ignore. She needed work. Any work. For the first time in years, Grace updated her resume. As she reviewed her history, painful memories surfaced. Decisions. Choices. Moments she wished she could undo. One name appeared repeatedly in her thoughts. David. The man she once believed wasn't enough. The man she left behind. The man who never stopped fighting. And for the first time, genuine regret arrived. Not regret for losing comfort. regret for losing character. But by then, she assumed it was too late. For years after leaving for America, David finally stepped off a plane onto African soil once again. The warm air felt familiar. Comforting. For a moment he simply stood still. Breathing. Remembering. So much had changed. The young man who left carried uncertainty. The man returning carried experience. His parents greeted him with tears. Friends celebrated his success. Community members proudly shared stories about him. People who once doubted him now spoke with admiration. Yet David remained humble. Because he understood something most successful people forget. Life can change quickly. Both upward and downward. Over the following weeks, David met local business leaders. Explored investment opportunities. Visited places from his childhood. Everywhere he went, memories followed. Some good. Some painful. One afternoon he drove past the apartment where he and Grace once lived. The building looked smaller than he remembered. Older. He parked nearby for a few minutes. Not because he missed her. Because he wanted closure. As he sat quietly, something unexpected happened. He realized he felt nothing. No anger. No resentment. No desire for revenge. Only gratitude. The heartbreak that nearly destroyed him had ultimately transformed him. Without it, he might never have become the person he was today. David smiled softly. Then drove away. Certain chapters belonged in the past. Or so he thought. Because destiny had one final surprise waiting. A surprise neither he nor Grace could possibly imagine. And it would arrive in the most unexpected way possible. A few months after returning, David launched a new regional office. The company needed administrative staff. Receptionists. Coordinators. Support personnel. Dozens of applications arrived. Human resources handled most of the process. David rarely reviewed entry-level candidates personally. His schedule was too busy. One morning, however, a staffing shortage forced him to visit the office unexpectedly. As he entered the building, employees rushed through the lobby preparing for interviews. Candidates waited nervously. Folders rested on their laps. Hope filled the room. Meanwhile, upstairs, Grace sat waiting. She desperately needed this job. After months of rejection, this opportunity felt important. Perhaps even life-changing. She checked her resume again. Then looked around. The company seemed impressive. Professional. Successful. Exactly the kind of organization she wanted to join. A receptionist approached. The final interview will begin shortly. Grace nodded nervously. Minutes later, candidates were escorted toward the conference area. At that exact moment, David entered through another hallway. Neither of them noticed. Not yet. Fate was moving quietly. Patiently. Preparing a meeting that had taken 4 years to arrange. Grace followed the interviewer toward a glass conference room. Her heart raced. She needed this opportunity. More than anyone knew. Then the door opened. She stepped inside. And froze. Because sitting at the far end of the room was a face she recognized instantly. A face she never expected to see again. David. The man she abandoned. The man she underestimated. The man she thought would fail. And as their eyes met for the first time in 4 years, the entire room fell silent. For several seconds, neither David nor Grace moved. The room seemed frozen in time. The interview panel glanced between them, immediately sensing something unusual. Grace stood near the doorway, gripping her resume so tightly that the paper crumpled in her hands. Her heart pounded. This couldn't be happening. Not here. Not now. Not after everything. 4 years. For long years had passed since she last saw him. Yet somehow she recognized him instantly. The difference was shocking. The David she remembered had been exhausted, overworked, constantly worried about money. The man sitting across the table looked completely different. Confident, calm, successful. He wore a tailored suit, but it wasn't the clothes that surprised her. It was his presence. The quiet confidence. The kind that couldn't be purchased. Only earned. For a brief moment, memories flooded her mind. The airport goodbye. The unanswered phone calls. The divorce papers. The night she walked away. Every decision returned at once. David looked at her. His expression remained composed. No anger. No bitterness. No revenge. That somehow made everything worse. Because Grace had spent years imagining this moment. If they ever met again, she expected him to hate her. Instead, he simply looked at her like someone from another chapter of his life. A chapter already finished. The interview manager cleared his throat. Mr. David, should we continue? David nodded politely. Of course. Then he looked directly at Grace. And smiled. A small, professional smile. Please have a seat. The simple sentence hit harder than any insult. Because in that moment Grace realized something painful. The man she left behind had moved forward. Completely. And for the first time, she was the one struggling to catch up. The interview began. But neither of them would ever forget those first few seconds. Because destiny had finally brought them face to face. And the hardest part was still ahead. Grace tried to focus. She truly did. But every question felt impossible. Not because the interview was difficult. Because David was sitting directly across from her. Listening. Observing. Watching. The same man she once dismissed as a dreamer now owned one of the fastest growing companies in the region. The irony felt overwhelming. The interview manager asked about her experience. Grace answered carefully. Questions about administration, customer service, scheduling, office management. She responded professionally. Yet her thoughts remained elsewhere. Eventually another panel member asked, "What motivates you?" Grace paused. The room became quiet. Years earlier she would have answered differently. She would have spoken about success, status, financial security. Now her answer surprised even herself. Second chances. The words escaped before she could stop them. Silence followed. David looked at her briefly. Then lowered his eyes to the paperwork. For the first time, emotion flickered across his face. The interview continued for nearly an hour. When it finally ended, the candidates were dismissed. Everyone left. Except Grace. She remained seated. Nervous. Unsure. The room gradually emptied until only she and David remained. The silence felt enormous. Neither knew where to begin. Finally Grace spoke. David. The name sounded strange after so many years. He looked up. Grace. Again silence. Then she whispered. You've done well. David smiled slightly. I've been fortunate. Grace almost laughed. Fortunate? No. She knew the truth. This wasn't luck. This was years of sacrifice. Years of struggle. Years she never witnessed. For the first time, she saw clearly what she had abandoned. Not a failing man. A growing man. And suddenly the weight of her choices felt heavier than ever. Over the next hour, they talked. Not as husband and wife. Not as enemies. Simply as two people whose lives had taken very different paths. David shared parts of his journey. The long nights. The failed deals. The years of uncertainty. The sacrifices. The setbacks. Grace listened quietly. Every success story carried hidden pain she had never seen. There were moments when David nearly quit. Moments when loneliness became unbearable. Moments when everything seemed impossible. Yet he kept going. Not because he was fearless. Because he refused to surrender. Then Grace learned something that shocked her. After the divorce, David had never remarried. He had dated occasionally. But business became his focus. Growth became his mission. Purpose became his companion. For a moment she wondered what life might have looked like if she had stayed. The thought hurt. Not because she wanted the past back. Because she finally understood its value. Then David asked about her life. Grace hesitated. The story felt embarrassing now. Michael's success. The luxury lifestyle. The collapse. The betrayals. The losses. The regret. She told him everything. When she finished, she expected judgment. Criticism. Perhaps satisfaction. Instead, David simply listened. Quietly. Respectfully. The response surprised her. "You don't hate me?" she asked. David leaned back thoughtfully. For a few seconds he said nothing. Then he answered. "I did." Grace lowered her eyes. David continued. "But eventually I realized something." "What?" "Hating you wouldn't change my future." The sentence struck her deeply. Because it revealed how much he had grown. While she spent years trapped inside regret, David spent years building a better life. And suddenly she understood the difference between moving on and merely surviving. A week later, the hiring committee completed its evaluations. Several candidates qualified, including Grace. Now David faced an unexpected decision. The easiest option would be rejection. Nobody would question it. Nobody would criticize it. Many people would even support it. After everything she had done, few would blame him. His advisors certainly didn't. One manager laughed when he learned the situation. "Surely you're not considering hiring her." Another shook his head. "Some doors should stay closed." David listened, but said very little. That evening he sat alone in his office. The city lights shimmered outside. On his desk rested Grace's application. Beside it sat dozens of others. He thought carefully. Not about the past. About the present. The truth was simple. Grace had earned the position. Her qualifications were real. Her interview was strong. Her references checked out. The only reason to reject her was personal history. And David had spent years building a company based on principles, not emotions. The next morning he made his decision. Human Resources sent an offer letter. When Grace opened the email, tears immediately filled her eyes. She had been hired. Not because of pity. Not because of their history. Because she deserved the opportunity. For the first time in years, hope returned. And that single decision revealed something extraordinary about David's character. Success had made him powerful. But forgiveness had made him strong. Months passed. Grace adapted well to her new role. She worked hard. Arrived early. Stayed late. Determined to rebuild her life honestly. The company continued expanding. New opportunities emerged. New projects launched. And gradually, the awkwardness between her and David faded. They remained professional. Respectful. Nothing more. At least at first. One afternoon, Grace visited a company event celebrating another year of growth. Hundreds of employees attended. Families gathered. Children laughed. Music filled the air. During his speech, David stood before the crowd and reflected on his journey. Then he said something that captured everyone's attention. The greatest lessons in life often arrive disguised as heartbreak. The audience applauded. But Grace felt tears forming. Because she understood exactly what he meant. After the event, she approached him. For a moment neither spoke. Then Grace finally said the words she had carried for years. "I'm sorry." David looked at her. Truly looked at her. And smiled. Not because the past didn't matter. Because he no longer lived there. "I know." That was all. No dramatic reunion. No sudden romance. No fairy tale ending. Just peace. And sometimes peace is more powerful than reconciliation. As the sun set behind the city skyline, David watched employees celebrating together. Families laughing. Dreams growing. Lives changing. Everything he once hoped for had become reality. Not because life was fair. Not because success came easily. But because he kept moving forward when giving up would have been easier. Grace stood nearby watching him. Finally understanding the lesson that took years to learn. Character creates success. Success does not create character. And in the end, the man she once called a failure became the greatest example of that truth.